Welcome to the History Unplugged podcast, the unscripted show that celebrates unsung heroes, myth-busts historical lies, and rediscovers the forgotten stories that changed our world. I'm your host, Scott Rank. In the 1760s, almost no one would be worse at fighting for their independence than the American colonies. They were completely incapable of organized resistance. One's loyalty was to his state, as the idea of being an American was almost meaningless. Few people even clamored for democracy, because Europe and the rest of the world thought that the highest form of government was monarchy. Democracy was something that you read about in your classical education that Athens tried to do, but it just led to internal chaos and disorder for how rowdy it was. And after all, most American colonists consider themselves British, or at least subjects of the British Empire. But if you fast forward a decade later, by 1776, the United States is formally declaring itself as a new nation in which all men are created equal. They're able to put together a continental army that challenges the preeminent military superpower on planet Earth. Beyond that, many people are starting to consider themselves as Americans. So how did so much change in 10 years? If you grew up in the United States, you learn about American history, and it's almost assumed that there was this American identity that just needed to be woken up and triggered by acts of repression by the British government. But it's a lot more complicated than that. To untangle this in this episode, I'm talking with Michael Troy, who's host of the American Revolution podcast. His show is a chronological history of the Revolutionary War, and he goes deep into details, because at the time of our recording, he was 75 episodes into the show and only up to the year 1775. In this episode, we discuss, among many things, the Stamp Act and why Britain's backing down may have made things worse, the Liberty Riots, which led to the military occupation of Boston in 1768, how the Coercive Acts helped unite the colonies rather than isolate Massachusetts, and the many ways that Britain could have avoided the Revolutionary War altogether if they would have been more diplomatic, and what history would have looked like if America had never gained independence. So we get into all these different things, and I hope you enjoy this discussion with Michael Troy. Michael, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
You're a few dozen episodes into your podcast. As of this recording, how many episodes have you done?
I think I just published episode 75 last week.
Okay, so that's my division isn't great. How many dozen would that be? Over 6. Okay, there we go. Thinking of my multiples of 12. Okay, so you're over 6 dozen episodes into the podcast, and something I'm curious about is, have you seen any sort of benefit of studying the Revolutionary War period and getting beyond the middle school, high school, college level analysis that most of us have, if we have that much?
Yeah, I think most people think of the Revolution, they think of maybe 3 or 4 major battles and we got independence. They don't get into the whole story, what was really going on with the people at the time, the struggles, why they did what they did, and you know, really that it was about an 8-year war with quite a bit of struggle even before the war started. So it was really a lengthy process.
And that's what we're going to touch on today, are the main triggering points that caused the revolution to happen. And I'm very curious on your take that you think is something that has been either not focused on enough, or maybe there's something that you think has been overemphasized. It's not just a few battles. It's not just the Boston Massacre, a few people throwing rocks at soldiers, and then suddenly that causes the whole thing to go off. So, yeah, let's go through this. I mean, you've highlighted a lot of these issues in your podcast, and I'd like you to discuss how all these work together to cause the revolution. So let's start off with something that people do know well, and that is the Stamp Act. Many people hate the Postal Service, but I'm not sure there's many people who would engage in an armed revolt because the price of postage increases in 3 or 4 cents. Are colonials more price sensitive to the cost of postage, or how would you describe this as one of the first triggering events that leads to the revolution?
Really, that's why I guess one of the misconceptions of the revolution, a lot of people think that it was caused by high taxes, and it really wasn't. Colonists were taxed less than individuals in Britain were overall, and very happily paid taxes to their colonial governments. What they were not ready to do was pay taxes to Parliament where they had no representation. The old taxation without representation line we often hear. And the stamp tax was the first attempt to do that. There had been some earlier attempts like the Sugar Act and things like that, but those could be written off as import duties, which there wasn't as much agreement on that those were unacceptable. The stamp tax taxed all paper production essentially in America. If you wanted to produce a magazine or a newspaper or have a contract for that would be admissible in court, all of those would have to have tax duties on them. And the reason the colonists were really so upset about this, again, was not the amount so much as it was the precedent. They had seen the way England had sucked the money out of places that were not represented in Parliament. Ireland and Scotland are examples of that. Ireland especially, where they had no representation in Parliament, and Britain just really kind of sucked them dry of any excess wealth anytime they could. Places like Bengal and India experienced the same thing. And even though this was just a little tax, it was the foot in the door that was going to lead to more and more and more and more down the road. And they did not want to go down that road.
Right. And that's a good point where you and others have really tried to look at things from a global perspective, that Americans are aware of Britain's global empire and the colonies they have across the world and see the precedent happening. One point you made is that Britain's backing down on this may have made things worse. So what do you mean? Do you think that things could have gone better if they would not have relented?
If Britain had really stamped down at the time or come up with a minor compromise by perhaps giving the colonists a few representatives in Parliament that would have been really ineffective in really accomplishing much of anything, I think the colonies were not in a position, and we're talking about 1765 now, to really start a revolution. The people really hadn't developed that mindset, and they really didn't have as much resources as they would a decade later. If there had been any sort of really outbreak at that time, I think Britain would have won much more easily. The fact that Britain relented eased things for a time, but it gave the colonists the idea that, well, if we just stand up to London and say, no, we're not going to accept what you tell us we have to do, we will eventually win. And that attitude grew in the colonies over the next decade, and was a problem when things did go down in the 1770s.
With the state of affairs in the 1760s, what did that look like in the colonies? My information is very scant. It comes from mostly a biography on Benjamin Franklin I read, and they made the point that he was one of the very few people who was a national figure, who knew people in the different colonies and had a voice that could be projected to them via all of his printing activities. But the states were pretty set off from one another, and there was very little of a collective identity. So is this the state of affairs in the 1760s?
That's true. That is something that changed from the 1760s to the 1770s, but especially in the 1760s, colonies did not talk to each other. They really weren't even supposed to trade directly with each other. If Massachusetts wanted to send something to New York, it had to go to London first. That didn't always happen, but that's the way it was supposed to happen. But yeah, the colonies did not really think of their neighbors as fellow colonists. They thought of them as another country almost. And one reason for this was that they were in competition very often. Many of the colonies were claiming the same Western lands and didn't really go to war because they knew London would have to sort it out for them at the end, but they were competitors for the same resources.
And this is an aside, but your description brings something to mind. I recently did an episode on mass panic and mass hallucination, and the Salem witch trials were a part of that, which is in the late 1600s. Not even a century before this, so could be within living memory of some people at this time in the 1760s. Somebody asked me, what happened to the Puritans? It seems we talk about them in the Salem witch trials and maybe the first Thanksgiving, but then they exit the story, it seems. Do they just assimilate into the wider culture? And there's different colonies are set up. There's the middle colonies, these tobacco plantationists. There's southern colonies, these people who come from the Caribbean and work on sugarcane. Have these differences mostly disappeared, or is there still a distinct New England Puritan, increased Mather, Cotton Mather, versus a tobacco plantationist versus a person who has sugarcane?
Yeah, there really is a big distinction. It's especially noticeable, say, between New England and New York, which had very different cultures, very different backgrounds. Of course, New York developed from the Dutch settlers who started there originally. But yeah, New England, the Puritans had mellowed out, but they were still very much there. If you want to talk about something that most people don't really talk about as far as the Revolution, there was actually an incident where Britain just started talking about the idea of putting Anglican bishops in New England in the 1760s. And the colonists just went nuts over that. There was no way they wanted Anglican bishops in their Puritan environment. So there were still very many holdovers from the Puritan radicalism that we saw in the 1600s.
Okay. And something else that you discussed on the episode were the Liberty Riots, which was interesting because you discuss how it leads to the military occupation of Boston. I think I always just assumed that British soldiers were always there, as if an empire would just staff its overseas colony with soldiers without even thinking of the pay. And that'd be pretty expensive. So what happens with the Liberty Riots, and how does it lead to military occupation?
Yeah, there were always some soldiers in the colonies, but we're really talking like dozens or maybe hundreds over the entire North American continent. It was not a lot. And most of them were there. They might put a dozen soldiers in a fort that wasn't particularly important at the moment just to make sure nobody came in and stole the cannon or something like that. They weren't really there to do law enforcement or keep order or anything like that. They were just kind of there to watch British property. The colonies very much liked governing themselves, defending themselves. They knew they could rely on British regulars if something terrible happened, like a huge Indian uprising or the French invaded them or something like that. But by and large, they wanted to run their own defense, and they did it primarily through the militia system. So when Britain started trying to enforce things that the colonists did not like, one of the weaknesses, of course, of a militia system is that militias are all volunteers, and if they don't want to enforce a law they don't like, then the law doesn't get enforced. And the Liberty Riots was an attempt to enforce some very unpopular tariffs that were passed after the Stamp Act. These were the Townshend Acts, including the tax on sugar and tea. Tea especially is the one we all know about. And the people of Boston essentially rose up when a ship named the Liberty, which was owned by a young merchant named John Hancock, was seized by officials for evading tariffs. And they basically forced the entire customs agency to leave Boston and go live on an island out in the harbor for a few months, because if they showed their face in Boston, they were going to get beaten up or possibly worse.
Here's something I'm curious about. We talk about things from the perspective of the United States, at least in the United States, if you're hearing this story. I've actually heard from British people that they know almost nothing about the Revolutionary War. To them, it's as opaque as, I guess, for Americans, the Napoleonic Wars. Maybe you heard about it, but you really don't know what's going on.
Sure.
What's happening in Britain in the 1760s? They're passing all these different acts, but I can't imagine they would pass restrictive measures on colonists just out of the cruelty of their heart. Were they in a budget crunch, or is there some other reason that this is happening?
Well, yeah, the big problem was they were still trying to get out of debt from the 7 Years' War, something that was known as the French and Indian War here in America. But that really was a world war. And the way Britain was able to win such wars was to borrow a lot of money and build up their armies and navies to defeat the enemy. And they actually had to spend a lot of money to pay colonial militias here in America to get them to fight the French Canadians, which eventually resulted in Britain taking over Canada at the end of that war. But it left Britain in very heavy debt, and their economy was not doing particularly well. So they actually tried to levy some taxes in England, but because the English people were represented in Parliament, they balked, and Parliament was very reluctant to raise taxes in England. So then British officials, of course, thought, well, we spent all this money to make North America free. Maybe they need to start kicking in for some of this. And that was, where they tried to do a series of different taxes in different ways to see what would work and what would be most profitable and what the colonists would most accept so that they could